It's terrible that after 50 years it is behind closed doors, and I've no intention. Now I've started to stop now. I'm determined to put an end to this.
The palace had prepared the country for a quiet announcement, but nobody expected what came. Next, Princess Catherine stepped forward alone, looked directly into the cameras and delivered her message with a stillness that shook the foundation of the monarchy. Yet it was not merely her presence that left the nation speechless. Camilla had been quietly stripped of her queen consort title, and the woman at the center of the moment was reportedly left bedridden within hours of the news reaching her private rooms. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss a single update. Catherine felt the weight long before she entered the room. That afternoon, her message was not framed as a personal victory. It was positioned as a recognition that the institution itself had entered a transition the public could no longer ignore. That mattered because the monarchy visibility has always depended on how clearly ordinary people understand who carries authority in moments of change. Then came the sentence that changed everything inside the palace walls. Catherine announced that the title of Queen Consort had been formally removed from Camilla, and that the role would no longer carry constitutional weight during the remainder of the king's life. A consort has title in simple terms refers to the formal designation given to the spouse of a reigning monarch, and stripping it removes both symbolic and protocol-based standing. Those words moved Camilla from a position of public partnership toward something much closer to private presence. Inside the palace, several members of staff stopped moving. When the sentence reached them, the silence in the room lasted longer than the applause that followed outside. William heard those words from a private adjoining room, and pride collided with something far heavier within him. When his wife reached the phrase recognizing a new order inside the household, the prince lowered his eyes. He knew what the public could. Not every public clarification of rank resets private dynamics. No press release will ever describe. He did not step in. He simply let the moment belong to her. That restraint was its own confirmation of how much had changed between them and inside the institution. They were now being asked to carry Charles shaped the meaning of the moment only. Hours before the cameras rolled, the king had reviewed the final wording and approved a single clause that changed everything, replacing the phrase honoring the consort's service with the more clinical language, recognizing that the role no longer serves the institution as it once did. The institution, in plain terms, refers to the monarchy itself, its duties, symbolism, and public standing. Catherine had been asked to read that truth aloud because the king believed the public was ready to hear it from a voice they trusted more than his own. Camilla understood the significance as clearly as William did, although her understanding carried an entirely different weight. While the public heard reassurance, those closest to the crown heard a final word being placed over years of careful negotiation. The former queen consort knew this was not Catherine speaking beyond her authority. Camilla recognized in the same breath that the woman standing at the cameras had been trusted to deliver something the king himself had chosen not to announce personally. The real shock was that Camilla's closest advisors had already begun quietly clearing her engagements from the schedule before the broadcast had even finished airing. Now, what had happened behind closed doors before the world ever heard her historic voice? Behind Catherine composed reading stood four people carrying four entirely different versions of the same afternoon. William saw his wife stepping publicly into a place that had always been protected for him alone. Charles saw the monarchy beginning to acknowledge a future structure it had long avoided naming openly. Camilla saw a balance of influence being quietly concluded rather than debated. And Catherine understood that once the address ended, she could never again be viewed merely as the supportive royal figure standing one step behind. Before Catherine was brought into the formal setting, William asked a single question. Was she certain? She looked at him for a long moment before answering that certainty was impossible. But duty could not always wait for certainty. He did not argue, he simply reached for her hand. His hesitation had never been about whether she was capable. It came from knowing what this confirmation would cost their private life in the weeks that followed. That mattered because the monarchy future depends on succession, which means the order in which the crown eventually passes, and on whether the public trusts the people who would one day carry that responsibility before any formal transfer forces the question into the open. Charles had been thinking about that question for some time. In several private conversations, the king had spoken about what he called visible clarity. The idea that the monarchy future structure must become familiar to the public before any formal transition makes the change unavoidable. he was thinking about whether the household itself could be reshaped in ways the public would accept rather than resist. Camilla felt the shift from an entirely different direction when the finalized broadcast schedule reached her office. She noticed her own engagements had been quietly rearranged. The most prominent evening slot, the one she had been told was being held for her, was now listed under Catherine. Name. Camilla read the page once, then again. The former queen consort finally set it down and asked with almost unsettling calm, "Was this always the plan?" Nobody in the room rushed to answer, and that silence carried its own meaning. William still struggled with the speed of it all. He knew every new responsibility would bring more scrutiny, more judgment, and less space for Catherine to simply be herself off camera. Yet he also knew Charles had already begun trusting her with something deeper than ceremony. The future king could protect her from some pressures, but not from the constitutional importance now being placed on her voice. Every royal turning point has a moment that looks ordinary until history gives it meaning. Catherine's address was no exception. Weeks before the cameras went live, one engagement placed her in a situation no carefully prepared briefing could control. There was simply a private conversation between father and son, an unexpected reaction from an older family member, and King Charles watching Catherine respond in a way he would not forget. Catherine arrived at a small family gathering held inside one of the private residences, expecting only a brief exchange of greetings. Then the moment broke apart. A senior member of the family began speaking to Catherine about the pace of change inside the household, and the conversation quickly became pointed. The criticism stopped being subtle. The princess did not retreat. Instead of offering a quick diplomatic response and moving elsewhere, she stayed beside the conversation, ignored the quiet signals from aides, and let the moment unfold at its own pace. William saw the delay and felt concern before he felt pride. He knew how easily an unpredictable personal moment could overwhelm his wife, or become something the public misunderstood. Yet, as the prince watched Catherine keep her focus entirely on the difficult conversation, his anxiety shifted. She was not performing composure. She was refusing to walk away from a conversation that needed to be finished in the room where it began. Charles noticed the same thing from only a few feet away. Later, the king closed the door of a private room and spoke to William without aides present. He told his son that Catherine possessed something no briefing could manufacture: constitutional patience, meaning the ability to absorb tension inside a room without making it louder. That mattered because household authority could not be ordered by the crown. It had to be visible before any future transition asked the country to accept greater change. That evening, Charles moved from observation to decision. He requested formal options for a direct national address, initially framing the idea as a symbolic message of clarity. Then, one senior royal challenged the entire plan, forcing the question everyone had avoided: was Catherine still simply supporting the future king, or had she become powerful enough to speak for the institution itself? Royal conflict rarely begins with raised voices. It begins with pauses that last too long, questions phrased too carefully, and people realizing that everyone in the room understands what is really being discussed. When Catherine proposed state-style address reached its final planning stage, one private meeting exposed the tension beneath the polished palace surface. Camilla looked directly at Catherine and refused to soften the question. Did she understand how a standalone message would be interpreted once the public saw her speaking without William beside her? The former queen consort was challenging the precedent, meaning the example a single royal action creates for what may happen again in the future. Once Catherine occupied that space alone, the meaning could not easily be pushed back into something smaller. Catherine did not retreat. She said quietly, "I understand exactly how it will be interpreted." Her answer changed the temperature of the room, because she did not deny the scale of what was happening. She accepted it. William was ready to intervene, but Catherine raised one hand slightly toward him. She wanted no protection in that moment. If her new role carried independent authority, then she had to defend the decision independently too. He stopped, watched her carefully, and understood that the woman beside him was already behaving differently. Under pressure, Camilla pressed further. She argued that the crown depended upon hierarchy as much as affection, and that publicity should never quietly become constitutional expectation. Hierarchy in this context meant the established order of royal rank and responsibility that prevents personal appeal from replacing formal authority. Admiration could become expectation, and expectation could eventually reshape power in ways the institution could not easily reverse. Charles finally ended the argument. The king placed his pen down and said the broadcast would proceed unchanged, no compromise, no diluted wording. His decision made one point unmistakable. Catherine expanded. Position was not being created by headlines, popularity, or accident. It was being deliberately authorized from within the crown itself. William said little after that, but his silence now carried the greater question. Charles could approve the moment he could open the door, yet the future king would have to decide whether Catherine authority remained temporary protection for the monarchy or became something permanent within their eventual reign. Catherine heard his hesitation before he fully explained it. Alone after the meeting, the prince admitted that part of him still wanted to protect her from becoming indispensable. He knew what happened to people who became essential to the crown. Their private life became smaller. Every absence was questioned, every decision examined, and every moment of weakness carried public meaning. Then Catherine answered with the clarity that had already unsettled the room earlier. Avoiding responsibility, she told him, would not give them their privacy back. It would simply allow fear to decide what they were willing to become. William studied her for several seconds. Then he said quietly, "Then we do this together." That sentence changed more than the mood. William authorized his household to begin treating Catherine as an independent principal for selected major engagements. An independent principal meant a senior royal whose duties could be planned and carried in her own right, rather than automatically attached to another person's schedule. For Catherine, it was a subtle administrative change with enormous symbolic weight. The change was immediate. Invitations, briefings, and major decisions started reaching Catherine's office in a different order than before. Some doors were opening faster, and other offices were beginning to notice the broadcast lasts only minutes. Its consequences begin almost immediately. Camilla felt the change in the most personal way. After watching the address, she returned to her private sitting room expecting silence. Instead, an aide arrived with an updated engagement file showing several duties she had previously held being quietly reassigned. The former queen consort read the page once, then again. Within hours of the broadcast finishing, she was reported to be confined to her rooms. By evening, those close to her described her as unable to leave her bed. That stillness was more revealing than anger, because the new order was no longer theoretical. It was appearing in schedules, in staff movements, and in health. Catherine felt something entirely different. Rather than celebrating, she turned to William and asked whether she sounded too certain. The question caught the prince off guard. He reminded her that certainty was never the point. She was asked to sound responsible, not invulnerable. That distinction mattered, because the public had responded to her humanity as much as her authority. Charles sent a message before the noise grew louder. The king wrote only a few lines by hand, telling Catherine that authority is strongest when the person carrying it remembers whom it exists to serve. She read the note twice. For her, the words carried more weight than any headline. William soon received another shock. International broadcasters were already describing Catherine not simply as the Princess of Wales, but as the clearest symbol of the monarchy next era. The future king understood the danger and promise in that language. Public confidence can strengthen the crown, but it can also create expectations. Nobody can easily contain. Catherine barely had time to process any of it before the headlines reached her. Charles asked to see her alone and away from advisors' schedules and strategy. After all the planning, protocol, and tension, the turning point came without an audience. Charles and Catherine met privately, with no aides taking notes and no advisors shaping the conversation. The king was speaking to the woman who may one day stand beside his son when the full weight of the crown becomes theirs. Charles did not begin with praise. He told Catherine that the address was never designed only to calm the country for one evening. Clarity in this sense means allowing people to recognize and trust the next structure of royal authority before succession forces it fully into place. Catherine listened carefully, then admitted what had been troubling her since the speech ended. She feared the address might look presumptuous, as though she had stepped into a space that was not yet hers to occupy. Charles answered without hesitation. Her reluctance, he said, was exactly what convinced him she was ready. People who chase authority often misunderstand its cost, while those who fear its weight are more likely to carry it carefully. Charles then acknowledged what Catherine and William had already surrendered to: royal duty, privacy, ordinary family moments, and the freedom to make mistakes without public judgment. Catherine grew emotional, but did not interrupt. For once, the sacrifice was being named rather than quietly expected. Then came the confirmation she had not fully expected. Charles told her that the address had been a genuine turning point. Catherine would continue receiving selected responsibilities. In her own right, not simply through William's position, the decision did not separate her from the prince. It prepared them to carry future responsibility as two people trusted individually. And together Catherine finally asked what he expected from her. The king gave an answer, far simpler than any formal briefing. He told her the crown does not need another imitation of someone who came before, it needs her to remain recognizable as herself. When pressure is greatest, Catherine left the conversation with no remaining doubt about what the palace intended. The palace can only decide responsibility. It cannot decide public belief. By the time Catherine address ended, the story no longer belonged to Buckingham Palace. It belonged to television, studios, newspaper editors, crowds gathering behind barriers, and millions of viewers. Yet among thousands of headlines, one simple public moment captured the emotional force of the evening better than any expert analysis. Strangers standing outside the palace applauding a woman who could not hear them. William watched part of that reaction beside Catherine, and the scale of it became uncomfortable. Almost immediately, the prince listened until the conversation turned toward the sacrifices his wife had made. Then he lowered the volume. Catherine noticed she did not ask him to turn it back up. Outside Buckingham Palace, the response took on a life of its own. A small evening crowd grew behind the barriers as people continued arriving after the broadcast. One woman raised a handwritten sign carrying 5 simple words. "Thank you, Catherine, we heard you." When the palace lights remained visible beyond the gates, applause began without warning. It spread through the group until strangers were clapping together for someone who could not hear. Then William heard about that moment through an aide and looked toward Catherine without immediately telling her. Public affection has always surrounded royal figures, but this felt different because it had formed around responsibility rather than celebration. The future king knew that kind of trust could strengthen the crown, but it could also place a crushing expectation on the person receiving it. Catherine saw the next morning has front pages. Soon afterward, one paper placed her photograph beneath the stark headline, "Her Moment." Another declared, "The future speaks." She stared at them without smiling. The applause was enormous. The headlines were historic. Neither could deliver the final verdict. That judgment